Evacuation. More than 100,000 men, women, and children, all of Japanese ancestry, removed from their homes in the Pacific Coast states to wartime communities.
So, again, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Kathy May Dutong, and I am from Westside Student Life, and I am an activities coordinator. Today, I have Shafiq.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining this event. My name is Shafiq. I am also from Westside Student Life from Central Washington University, and I am a member of the CAT team. I'm very excited and glad to be here.
Thank you, Shafiq. So let's start. Today, we have a very special guest speaker, Em Halladay Ptachek Choi, and they are a Chinatown International District Community member who studied comparative immigration histories of Korean diaspora in Japan and Japanese diaspora in America at the University of Washington. They are also the collection specialist at the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Washington. And further, they are the programming assistant for Seattle Asian American Film Festival. After I introduce Em will also introduce the topic for today. Welcoming Em.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's really awesome to be here and to get to share some of this history. Most of the presentation is going to be kind of thinking about Japanese-American history, and in particular, Japanese-American incarceration in a way that really incorporates a lot of the different aspects of Japanese-American history. Generally, incarceration is taught and talked about as a very isolated event. So the goal of this kind of conversation is less to teach you about camp experience and what happened from from 1942 to 1945, but instead more to talk about the patterns that allowed for Japanese American incarceration to happen at such a large scale here in the United States. If that's good, we'll get on started here. And just like a quick kind of topic breakdown of what we're going to talk about a little more in depth. We're going to start with early immigration history, just to give a little bit of the context, understanding kind of how we get to a point of Nihonmachis and booming businesses, which we'll talk about then in the Exclusion Era. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences between Japanese-American Exclusion Era and Chinese-American Exclusion Era. Then, of course, we'll get into World War II experiences and really talk about the differences between Issei and Nisei, so first generation and second generation experiences, while also kind of talking a lot about language, which I think is a conversation that's popped up kind of recently on a larger scale. Definitely a conversation that's really been increasing in the past about 3 years. Then we'll talk about the post-war experience, talking about it mostly as how global politics affect the way that domestic history is talked about and taught, and really examine the ways that this history is either obscured or is kind of put into a different light because of those global politics that are happening. We'll have some time for questions as we transition from topic to topic, but we'll also have time for questions at the end. So feel free to drop those in the chat. I don't really have the ability to see the chat while I'm sharing my screen. So Shafiq or Kathy, if you're able to kind of read those out as we're going along, that'll be very helpful. But kind of getting started, we really just want to reframe the ways that we think about Japanese American history in its entirety. I say that really talking about how, as I mentioned before, incarceration is taught as a very isolated experience. I think generally Japanese American incarceration is taught kind of as Pearl Harbor happens, incarceration happens, and then redress happens. of course, that's not the case. There was a buildup to it, and there was, of course, a consequence after. So we're going to talk about kind of as much of that as we can and really try to dismantle the idea that Japanese-American incarceration was this very teleological and linear event, because it wasn't. There was a lot that went into creating an environment and an atmosphere where incarceration was seen as a good option. Of course, hopefully I don't need to say this, but incarceration is not a good option, really should not have been an option at all, but we'll talk about how we got there. Starting out with early immigration, really we're going to talk about, there's kind of two main booms that are happening. There's the Hawaii boom, where folks are really immigrating from Japan to Hawaii. This starts in the 1870s, but the bulk of it is happening in the 1880s. When we talk about immigration, generally we use this sort of language of push and pull factors. If I had like 12 hours, we could go way deep into how even that is problematic language, but I don't. So we're still going to kind of use that framework. But I did want to acknowledge that, of course, this isn't the only framework that you can use to think about immigration motivations and experiences. Of course, the first big push for that sort of immigration to Hawaii is the Meiji Restoration or the Meiji Revolution. It has a lot of names. Basically, Japan had been run by a military state that then sort of used the emperor as sort of a puppet figure, or more of just a general symbolic figure. And that sort of shifts in the Meiji Revolution or Meiji Restoration to a point where the emperor becomes more incorporated into that military state and becomes more of a decision maker once again. One of the big consequences of this, there were many, but one of the big ones is tax reform. This seems very boring, and it probably is, but I sat through a lot of classes about it, so now I have it learned in my brain. But one of the major tax reforms was land taxes and property taxes. And so because of this, a lot of the kind of farms in more rural areas that are run by a single family, maybe have been for generations, they're starting to find that it's unsustainable at this point, given the increase in taxes. So because of this, you see a lot of folks from more rural areas of Japan. Of course, I say rural, this is rural at the time, not rural now. At the time, spaces like Hiroshima and Fukuoka, those are still relatively rural, predominantly farming areas. And so that's where a lot of folks are coming from. One of the big pull factors is sugar plantation recruiters. These sugar plantation recruiters from Hawaii used to actually go to Japan and, you know, of course, sell that American dream, right? You can come, you can work, make a lot of money. You're not going to have the same tax issues that you have here in Japan, right? You don't have to pay the expenses of the upkeep of a farm. Instead, you'll just be using your farming skill set for someone else's, right? Of course, as we get into that mainland boom, that's not the case, right? It's low wages, it's backbreaking labor. It's not everything that had been kind of promised along the way. So that's also why with the mainland boom, we almost see two different immigration groups, right? We see folks migrating from Hawaii to the mainland, but you also see folks migrating directly from Japan to the mainland as well, right? For the push factor there, we see primarily plantation workers' rights. As I mentioned, not everything that had been promised to them would be fulfilled. But on top of this, right, we're still at a time where unions are predominantly restricted to European or white Americans. So if you are even having these contentions, you don't have the safety of a union. You don't have that like community group to be able to leverage for increased rights or protections. Of course, on the other end of that, for the group migrating from Japan, you do still see Meiji reforms, but even more so, you're not just seeing this major economic shift, you're seeing a big social shift as well. The Meiji Restoration is talked about in a very strange way. People acknowledge that it changed a lot, but they're hard pressed to talk about the specifics. And I think that's because the Meiji Restoration just changed so much. You could fill an entire 1,000-page book with everything that changed during this time. Of course, it wasn't just that wealth distribution and those tax reforms, but I mean, there was this huge shift in how women in politics were viewed, how queerness and homosexuality was viewed. There was even this big shift in how time was perceived, right? All in this hope to sort of unify and really the word you'll hear a lot is modernize Japan. Of course, most of this was just basically taking what they viewed as very Western ideals or Western structures and mapping that onto Japan. But nonetheless, it created this drastic change, which any number of changes, right, could motivate someone to leave. On the other end, right, we have those pull factors, the big one being American laboring jobs. I didn't put it on here, but I've already mentioned it once, and it's worth mentioning. You still have that American dream, right? It's a little bit different than what we see starting around the 1950s of, white picket fence, 2.5 kids. But I think America has always been sort of sold as this land of opportunity. In the late 1800s, it's really being viewed as this land of economic opportunity. But for Japanese diaspora in particular, it's very different because their immigration policies were so different from anyone else's in the sort of East Asia. Before we go deeper into those immigration policies and head into that exclusion era, are there any questions so far? Alrighty, no worries if there aren't. But as I was mentioning, right, the policies are very different. And when I say exclusion era, as you saw on the last slide, right, I'm talking about 1900 to 1942. These are very different dates from the Chinese exclusion era, right? That obviously is talking mostly about the Chinese Exclusion Act, but that exclusion era actually dates back to 1875. So a few years before the official policy is passed, with the passage of the Page Act. What happens for Chinese Americans is that women are restricted from immigrating much, much earlier on. Even before just generally Chinese Americans are restricted from immigrating, Chinese women are specifically called out in that Page Act. It really starts to say, well, hey, we are starting to see that people who can immigrate over, they'll start families here. And if we don't want that, how do we restrict that? Well, the easiest way, given the politics at the time, just restrict women. Just say that you think women will be a stain on the moral character of our nation, and boom, there you go, right? People can't settle. People can't have families. This is something that we see time and time again when we look at Asian American immigration policies, right? This is what restricted Filipino Americans from starting families in that first kind of early 1900s boom. This is what restricts Chinese Americans from starting families. This eventually, as you see in 1921, is what restricts some of the later Japanese immigrants from starting families, right? Before we get deep into that though, of course, by the time Japanese Americans were immigrating to the mainland, you still see these policies popping up with things like the alien land laws. These policies restricted the ability to own property to US citizens. That seems not as bad as it was, but of course, this is still a time when US citizenship is very explicitly dictated by race. This is something that's rooted actually at the very birth of our nation. 1775, you have a policy that explicitly states the only people eligible for citizenship in the US are white men of good moral character. This becomes the basis for almost all citizenship policies and laws really up until the 1960s. What this means is that most Asian immigrants cannot own property. And this is where the Japanese American experience differs a little bit. because at this point, before 1921, Japanese women are not restricted from immigrating. So this means that families can happen in the United States, which also means that they can have natural born US citizen children. This is a policy that has actually been contested often, but the Supreme Court multiple times has ruled in favor of natural born citizenship in the United States. Even in 1899, there's a Chinese American who goes to the Supreme Court and says, I was born in the United States, I should have the same right to citizenship as a white American born in the United States. And the Supreme Court says, technically, yes, that is what the law says. So because of this, Nisei, second generation Japanese Americans do have the right to own property. And this becomes really important in developing those Nihonmachis and Japantowns and those farming communities that take root here in the United States. Of course, not everything could be skirted around so quickly and so easily. In 1907, we have the Gentleman's Agreement, as it's called, which forces Japan to halt issuing any laboring passports to the United States. So Japan at the time had an immigration system where passports were almost sort of like visas, right? You get a visa for a specific purpose now, but that's kind of what they were doing with passports. So instead of having to restrict visas or anything like that, they simply stopped giving passports that are for the United States for laboring men. Of course, that means that the picture bride system, which basically allowed for men, Japanese men in the United States to bring women over, that's still happening, and that's still very strong. Of course, until, as I mentioned, 1921, the Ladies' Agreement, which puts an end to that system and really basically puts an end to most Japanese immigration to the States. Of course, if you know anything about Japanese American history, you probably know that Japantowns or Nihonmachis were still going pretty strong. They would be quite large in most Western cities. Here in Seattle, this is a map of the Seattle Japantown. It was about 72 square blocks. It was quite large, quite sprawling. It had a residential district, it had a business district. It really was a dominant part of what we think of as the Chinatown International District today. Of course, if you have been to the CID recently, you know this is not the case anymore. But this was similar to LA and San Francisco and Portland. These Japantowns were growing at a really steady rate, in part because of those differing immigration policies, but also in part because of what I call the like economic exclusion. I say I call, a lot of people call it that. This is predominantly what people are talking about when they talk about sort of Japanese-American exclusion era, is these economic exclusions. What happens is that at the time, the US, specifically white Americans, are trying to find a way. They're like, how can we justify all of the bad things we want to do? Well, the economy is maybe not so great. You know what we can do? We can blame it on immigrants, right? We see it in the mid-1800s when white American laborers blame their difficulties finding jobs on Chinese American laborers. We see it again in the early 1900s when white American businesses start to blame Japanese American farms and businesses. Because of this, it led to a lot of spaces in white America restricting access to Japanese Americans, right? I mean, it was fairly common at the time, even as early as the 1900s, to see businesses that would not allow Japanese American customers. Restaurants wouldn't allow Japanese Americans in. Barbers were another big one. Here in Seattle in particular as well, there was a huge issue with entertainment, clubs, theaters, stuff like that. Because of this, Japanese Americans who have those second generation children who can purchase property, who can start businesses and all of this, they start to build their own economy. right? If I can't be let into the white American economy, I'll make my own. Of course, they also recognized that it wasn't just Japanese Americans who were being restricted from these businesses. It was Black Americans, it was Jewish Americans, it was other Asian American ethnicities, right? So they look at that and they say, here's a market that's not being served. Why don't we serve it? Of course, it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy then, right? White businesses that would have allowed those groups aren't seeing those folks coming into their businesses anymore, because why wouldn't you go to a space that's safer, that's more welcoming, that explicitly has been built because other communities are not being let into certain spaces, right? So as Japantown is booming, the white American economy kind of views it as this sort of proof, right? Oh, we were right the whole time. They're going to steal our business. They're going to make it harder for us to have our own businesses here in the States. So that cycle kind of keeps deepening those tensions. Here's just a few of what Seattle's Nihonmachi looked like back in the day. I believe this is on Jackson Street, a little bit further up near, kind of between 10th and 12th. Of course, here we have also on Jackson. This is actually the corner of Jackson and 5th. So back in the corner there, that's a bank now. We've got some of these businesses, their buildings are still around. Unfortunately, today, the only businesses from old Nihonmachi that have survived actually are the Panama Hotel, and that's a whole other story that we can talk about much later. And then also, Higo's. Now, Higo's is a little bit different. It's owned by a different family now, but at least that kind of namesake still lives on. Before we get into those camp years, any questions so far? Not seeing any? Okay, well, we'll keep trudging on. Of course, in 1941, in December, Pearl Harbor happens. And as I said, Pearl Harbor is not the beginning of this story. I will just repeat that over and over again, because for a really, really long time, that was how this history was taught. Pearl Harbor happened, and sure, maybe this was bad, but like we were scared, maybe like we just didn't know any better. This is totally false. This is actually just a complete lie. I don't know if I can curse, so I'll avoid cursing, but it was just false by all pretenses. One of the ways that we know this is the difference between internment and incarceration. For a long time, those terms were used kind of interchangeably. They are not interchangeable words, actually, though. Internment has an official definition by like legal standard here in the United States, and it really serves as the detention and incarceration of non-citizens. What this means is that when we use the term internment for the general experience of Japanese incarceration, we're further obscuring the fact that of those 120,000 individuals, 3/4 of them were US citizens, right? So that's just a quick note. If you hear me using incarceration versus internment, that's a very purposeful difference, just in the context of discussion in particular. Now, when I say that the Pearl Harbor justification was a total lie, and how do we know that? It is through the internment of Issei first-generation men. What happens is that in the immediate week following Pearl Harbor, we see the FBI going, raiding, and detaining most of the Issei leaders of Japanese-American communities. Now, you might think, how does that prove that it wasn't Pearl Harbor? Well, it's because these lists existed, right? The very fact that the FBI could go and find the community leaders of Japanese-American communities 2 days after Pearl Harbor happens means that these lists existed much longer than the duration between Pearl Harbor and when they started detaining Issei men, right? This is something, I believe the only like major thing I've seen acknowledge it was a film about the Hawaii branch of the Japanese-American sort of military men. But that's a whole other story. The big thing is just that the fact that these lists exist proves that the FBI had been thinking about this for a long time, and more importantly, had been surveying Japanese-American communities far before Pearl Harbor ever happened, right? Of course, Pearl Harbor does happen, and then we have not just Issei men being detained by the FBI, but we also see, right, these different orders. So Executive Order 9066 is a very large policy that actually has a lot of different parts to it. One part was that it officially designated the US as different military zones. So if you ever see policies that say military zone 1, 2, 3, and 4, those are a product of Executive Order 9066. And those didn't exist before 9066. On top of this, right, we have policies that now say that if you're Japanese American, there are certain things that are considered contraband for you now in the United States. This could be anything from, you know, guns, firearms, but also radios, televisions, right? These things were considered contraband, and you would have to go to the local police station and turn them in. If you didn't, you could yet again be detained by the FBI. They didn't know this at the time, but you could be considered then an enemy alien and deported. Of course, then we get to the big part of Executive Order 9066. I think the part that a lot of people know about, to what degree changes, but you know, a lot of people know that Order 9066 then led to the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans. This here is the removal order for San Francisco. There are no good photos of the ones from Seattle, but these different orders were posted in Nihonmachi's predominantly Japanese American areas. And it basically said you could have anywhere between 7 to 10 days to pack up everything, report to the local office, get your number, and go to somewhere. They didn't really know where. And we'll talk about kind of the different spaces that people would be sent to in the end. Let's see. Oh, here's the photo I actually wanted. One thing that's really important about this history locally that I really want to acknowledge and push home is that Bainbridge Island is actually the first Japanese American community to be removed from their homes, from their communities, and sent to what eventually, in the differentiation of everything, becomes known as temporary assembly centers. This is because incarceration was a very rushed process, right? Even though they had been kind of planning this, they had been surveying communities, they didn't fully understand the mass undertaking that this would be. I think they didn't fully understand just how many Japanese Americans. So because of this, they have to get sent to temporary camps before they can be sent to their permanent camp. These temporary assembly centers get built into fairgrounds, convention centers, really anywhere that there's enough pre-built space to build them. Most Japanese Americans here in Washington, especially Western Washington, were sent to what's known as Camp Harmony. This was on the grounds of the Puyallup Fairgrounds. So this is still where they hold the state fair, right? I believe there's like a statue acknowledging it. There has been a lot of back and forth with the fair about how do we acknowledge this history. There's very few good answers, but at least there's a statue outside the fair, I guess. In Oregon, I believe the major temporary assembly center was put into the Portland Convention Center. Still conventions that happen there. Basically, the underlying tone here is that these temporary assembly centers, despite being a major site of American history and trauma, are very rarely treated as such. Almost all of them following the war just reverted back to what they were originally used for. And most of them are still in use today. I believe for that Portland Convention Center, you have to go to like a very deep tab in their history page, even to find any information about it, right? Of course, as I mentioned, there is a very different experience for Issei and Nisei communities, right? Those Issei men that are interned are going to not even just earlier are they interned, but they're also going to different camps. They go to Department of Justice camps scattered. The biggest were Mexico and Montana. And it's a very different experience, not just because they're even more isolated than the rest of their community, but also because there is a very different perspective as to what these men might be capable of. Of course, throughout this entire experience, all of Japanese diaspora in the United States are being villainized and dehumanized. But I think Issei men even more so, because they were seen as community leaders, because they had this almost heightened eye on them, they have an even deeper experience within these camps as quote unquote enemy aliens. I really recommend the book, The Grave on the Wall. It is written by a Yonsei Japanese-American as he goes back to Japan. And it's really him understanding his own family history. However, his great-grandfather was interned as a community leader, I believe at Fort Missoula. And it talks a lot about how, because this was not just exclusively, you know, those heightened enemy aliens, but also because it was all men, there's this very different culture and experience within the camps. The dehumanization ties deeply into this sort of sense of masculinity versus femininity, something that becomes a really big theme in Asian American politics, not just at the time of the war, but even all the way up until now. We're still having these conversations about how do we define femininity and masculinity? Should we be defining femininity and masculinity within Asian American communities, right? For Nisei, it's a little different. These are folks who are US citizens. They've been born here, raised here, they went to school here, all of these different things. And it's a little any one unified experience. Of course, no one really had one unified experience. In particular is where you start to see these forming in the community. In particular, you see this with what's known as the loyalty questionnaire. This questionnaire really brought about a lot of the tensions that were kind of simmering under the surface, but it made a lot of Nisei question, right? Should we have to declare our patriotism through whether that's enlisting in the military, helping with the war effort, all of these different things, or should we acknowledge the trauma? Should we acknowledge the pain that the US government has put us through, right? And that becomes kind of a major point of contention. I chose some of these photos just because these are by a gentleman named Billy Mando. He is one of the, actually, I believe the only person to capture color photographs of the camps. These are all at Heart Mountain. And it kind of shows that for a lot of the Nisei and Sansei, this was still traumatic, but it was traumatic in a different way. For the Sansei in particular, this was probably the only experience they had up until this point. They were in camp or only a few years before. And so really what they understood about the Japanese American was camp, was this sort of fractured community and these sort of even more specifically fractured families, right? Moving into after the war, okay, break, any questions? Seeing
Yes.
ahead. Oh, yeah.
The difference between incarceration and what was the other word?
Internment.
Internment. So incarceration, they were Japanese-American, and internment, they weren't Americans?
I mean, this is a very like weird way, because I think all Japanese diaspora in the States are Japanese Americans, but yes, they were not American citizens if they were interned. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yes.
And then Ariza, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, how you doing? Thank you so much for giving this talk, Em. It's really enlightening about this experience. I was just wondering if the FBI was also tracking other Asian groups as well as Japanese groups. Is that something you happen to know?
I don't know. I think part of it was, right, the three major groups at the time are Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, and Japanese Americans. And because of the way that Japanese imperialism was happening, even back in the 30s, I think it became clear that China and the Philippines would be US allies. And so there was not necessarily the evidence of heavy tracking and surveillance, although I would not be surprised if there was.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Moving on to after the war, I have kind of this big theoretical question. How do global politics obscure domestic realities? There's a lot of different ways that this happens, but that's kind of going to be something I hope you can kind of sit and think about, not just during this discussion, but really for the rest of your time understanding current events and kind of how we talk about them. In the case of Japanese America, it's really defined by post-war relations in Asia. The big one being, I have a photo here. This is a very famous photo of a US military officer, like the head honcho of the military occupation. And then I forget if this is the prime minister or emperor. I believe prime minister. Oh, excuse me. No, this is definitely the emperor. Don't listen to me. But this is a very famous photo. People overanalyze the heck out of this. It becomes like every kid who studies Japan studies has to do a 10-page essay about how the general is taller than this guy. That's it. But all of this is to say, this occupation really does change the way that this history is talked about, right? Because not only does it mean that the US is occupying Japan and kind of a brotherly figure to Japan, as it's so often said, but it also means that the US has to maintain an allyship with Japan, an allyship that goes all the way to today. A lot of people consider Japan one of our best allies in East Asia. But this occupation is happening at the same time as this increased fear of communism, right? The domino theory really is usually used for the Vietnam War, but even diary entries and letters sent between US officials show that there was a big fear of the domino effect happening in Japan as well. There was this idea that if Japan finds out all of the bad things that the US has done, that the citizens will turn towards their neighbors, right? So they'll look towards what's happening in Korea, what's happening in China. And of course, at this point, China is already having a communist government. So what they do is they basically pretend that this didn't happen. The US really tries to obscure this history, both domestically and internationally. And this happens in a bunch of different ways. But domestically, I think the big one, the one with lasting consequences for up until now even, is the birth of the model minority myth. For folks who might not be as familiar with the model minority myth, right? It's the idea that Asian Americans are the best minority in America, right? They pull themselves from their bootstraps. They don't complain. They're really quiet. They don't get involved in politics. And a lot of this is rooted in post-war history in Japanese America. what happens is that around the late 50s, early 60s, the New York Times releases this article that says, wow, Japanese Americans are doing so great. Remember this time that we incarcerated all of them? They don't even talk about it. How amazing. And so this becomes sort of the basis for that idea and that kind of trope, is that Japanese America was so busy really just rebuilding after the war, right? They lost a lot of businesses, they lost a lot of farms, a lot of homes. And so they were so busy trying to rebuild that they didn't necessarily have the capacity, or for whatever reason, they didn't want to rock the boat to talk about these experiences. So it becomes this sort of widespread idea that Asian Americans, and even more specifically, Japanese Americans, aren't going to acknowledge this history. Of course, this changes in the 60s and 70s as we see the Asian American movement start to happen. We start to see people being more vocal about their experiences and their histories, right? It's really defined by these sansei, that third generation who would have been born either right before or in camp, going, hey, what happened to us wasn't okay. And so we start to see a building movement for redress, right? This starts to really take hold in the 80s when we finally start to see those court hearings, and they finally do rule in favor of Japanese America. I'm going a little bit quickly. That's kind of an oversimplification of it, but I think it's important to understand that really in those first 15 or so years immediately following the war, it's this combination of, you know, not wanting to disturb the boat, not wanting to rock the boat, also having these international relations that the US government believes are so inherently tied to whether East Asia likes them or not. All of these different things combine to create that kind of delay in redress and in talking about these histories. And I think is also why even today, a lot of Americans struggle to talk about this history, because for so long after it happened, there was this idea that we just shouldn't talk about it. Of course, I hope clearly by the fact that we're having these events and talking about these kind of experiences that's changing. But that's why even today there's those, you know, difficulties in language to these experiences, and, you know, being able to express this history in a way that is more than just Pearl Harbor to camp to reparations, right? There's a lot more than that went into how Japanese America experienced the 20th century. Alrighty, we have some time for questions. I know that's like a lot to lay on everybody.
I do have a question though. What do you think would be the impact of having events like this, events to talk about this part of this history? Why is it important to like talk about it now more than ever? Like,
yeah, I mean, I think as a lot of like Japanese American community organizations have pointed out, we're getting to a point where these patterns are very clearly starting to show themselves again, right? A lot of current events, not just immigration policies, but so many different aspects of what's happening in America today are really revealing that these patterns don't just go away if we hope that they do, right? We have to actively talk about them. We have to actively remember. Feels a little cheesy to say on their remembrance, but really, like, we have to remember how these patterns exist and how they happen in the hopes that we don't repeat them.
right. Thank you for your question. Personally, I have heard people say that, oh, it's not to name drop anybody, but I heard somebody say that it is a history of Japanese Americans. It's not my history. I don't really have the responsibility to learn about it because it's in the past. What do you say about that?
I would say that it is their history. Not to be too I don't know the right word here, but like not to be too light about it, but I mean, ask them if they've ever eaten a Rainier cherry. Ask them if they've ever eaten cabbage or strawberries or blueberries. Then it's their history, right? The idea that Americans were just this isolated community that then got sent to camps that then came back is like totally false, right? Everything in America has been connected basically since we industrialized as a nation, right? Farms affect the economy, businesses affect society, right? All of these things are so interconnected that it's really quite naive to believe that it isn't part of your history or part of your experience in the United States.
Right, because it's American history still. And since you're America, it's your history as well. It may not be your ethnicity or whatever, but it's your history. So yeah. Thank you for this. I didn't even know that this was happening until I read my email today. I'm like, oh, let's do this. So I really appreciate it. I learned a lot.
I'm so glad you came. I'm just happy to see folks and be able to talk about it a little bit.
I have a question. Like, how do we address, well, like, since I lived in Japan, like, I noticed the ways in which they are trying to erase like their colonial history. Not to say that, like, I'm not trying to like say like, oh, you know what, like incarceration was justified. Like, of course not. Like, this is never okay to incarcerate like citizens like this. But there's an uprising in Japanese nationalism, like in Japan, about like erasing their history, like not wanting to take responsibility for their colonial efforts in the Pacific, particularly in Southeast Asia. So like, how do I grapple with that? Like, how do I frame that?
There is really not an easy answer. I mean, especially as like a Korean American who studies very specific things in Japanese history and Japanese diasporic history. I think the biggest thing that I do is just remember the like separation, right? Like, as problematic as those push-pull factor framework is, it's still important to think about like the Japanese government failed the Japanese Americans that were coming here in the first place, right? Like, they weren't just failing the East and Southeast Asian nations that they were occupying and colonizing, they were failing their own citizens at the same time too. And so being able to recognize that, I think, helped me kind of parcel with that own sort of struggle in my own mind.
Chat, I'll read it for everybody. It's difficult for people to understand what the Japanese Americans went through if the details of camp are not mentioned. Shouldn't the details be given to really show people why these camps should never be a reality again?
Yes and no. I say that because I think there's a specific trend in the way that the details of camp are shown that are very exploitative. I think there's this sort of like newer term called like trauma porn, but that's like basically what it is, right? It's this sort of like, we'll show how bad it was so that we can pat ourselves on the back for not being that bad anymore. When you instead look at it from a framework of the patterns and the trends, I think it becomes easier to see that we're not better than that, right? This is happening all over again. We're just in the earlier stages of it. While I think that some of the details should be shown, right? Concept of incarcerating Americans alone based on their ethnicity should hopefully be scary enough. They could have been kept in luxury accommodations. The idea of incarcerating an entire ethnicity en masse should still be scary enough to say, hey, maybe we should think about the ways that we repeat our own histories.
Can I add to that? Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm Aika. I'm also from the Japanese Cultural and Community Center, Washington. Part of the impact of the camps as well is not just what happened during the years that Japanese Americans were incarcerated, but it's also impacted generations of people who never lived through that, including, I'm Yonsei, so including people of my generation and the next generation, we've lost a lot of the culture and language that a lot of other immigrant populations have. You know, a lot of people learn their family's language and speak it at home, and a lot of Japanese Americans didn't do that because of the pressure to assimilate. And so that's something that, like Em says, en masse, a lot of Japanese Americans don't speak Japanese.
We have another question from Tommy. He said that how long did it take to recover from the internment camps? Were they placed there until the end of the war, or more or less?
So not to be pedantic about language again, but so for the internment camps, it's a little bit different. Most of those Issei men that were interned ended up kind of near 1943, 1944, kind of around the time of the loyalty questionnaire. They were kind of allowed to request where else they get sent, in the sense that if they proved that they could help recruit community members for the military, they would actually be allowed to reunite with their families in their camps. I think a good example of this for kind of Washington folks, Genji Mihara was a big community leader here in Seattle. He was interned at Fort Missoula and then in New Mexico. And then eventually they kind of started to realize that like he could maybe help convince some people to join the military. So they allowed him to reunite with his family in Minidoka. Minidoka is kind of the main camp where folks from Washington were sent. So in that sense, they were allowed to leave the internment camps a little bit earlier. Now, for incarceration, it's like a whole other story that is very long and very complicated. But basically, starting around 1943, so about a year into incarceration, folks, if they were, you know, of good moral standing, whatever like weird, vague terminology that they were using, they could request to be sponsored by a white citizen, either to go work outside the camp or to go to school outside the camp. So folks who were able to get sponsored could leave basically any time after that, as long as they were sponsored. For mixed race Japanese Americans, it gets even more complicated. For folks who were mixed Japanese and white, there was like a whole checklist of things that if X is true, then, you know, they can leave. If X is not true, they can't leave. Going all the way down to like, is their mom white or is their dad white? If dad is white, they can leave the camp because they'll have a strong white male authority figure who can keep them in line, right? If mom is white, we better keep them, right? They even went like, they would analyze the community makeup that surrounded them, right? So if they had majority white friends, then yeah, maybe they can leave. If they had majority non-white friends, I don't know, maybe we should keep them, right? So it really was down to the specific individual. But generally, yeah, camps were closed around 1945. However, folks who, if they didn't have a home to return to, were given some leeway. They were allowed to stay for about another 9 months, I believe, until they could find temporary housing. And this is actually what the building behind me is the JCCCW building today. But it was actually right after the war used for temporary housing, as were a lot of like Japanese language schools and Buddhist churches and all of this. just because it was so difficult for Japanese Americans to find housing following the war. And I believe that was one of the conditions of leaving camp.
Wow, thank you so much, Em, for your wonderful answers. Although, as much as we'd like to talk more about it, we're out of time. We do appreciate everybody for attending. This has been very insightful and very educational, and I learned a lot personally as well. If you have any questions or would like to reach out, please email us, and then if you'd like to connect with JCCW, we would send you their email as well. Thank you so much for attending, everybody. It was so great to hear your questions. Thank you so much.